The morning Susanna Conley walked through the iron gate of the Langston wheat farm. She had a baby strapped to her back, dust on her boots, and not a single ounce of pride left to spend on hesitation. It was the late summer of 1873, deep in the rolling grasslands of central Kansas, where the sky stretched so wide and so blue that it made a person feel simultaneously free and utterly exposed. The wheat stood tall and golden across the Langston fields, acre upon acre of it swaying in the warm prairie wind, ready for the harvest that couldn't wait for anyone's grief or anyone's complicated situation. Harvest didn't care about widowhood. It didn't care about a 7-month-old baby girl named Clara, who was presently chewing on the hem of her mother's sun-bleached calico dress with great enthusiasm. Harvest came when it came, and work had to be done, and Susanna Conley needed to eat. She had ridden the last 8 miles in the back of a neighbor's wagon, sharing the space with 3 barrels of salt pork and a very opinionated rooster. And before that she had walked 7 miles from the town of Harding, where she had spent the last of her husband's meager savings on a single room at Mrs. Albright's boarding house for the month of July. August had arrived without invitation, and with it the understanding that the room money was gone. The sympathy of Harding's townspeople had run its natural course, and Susanna was going to need to find work if she wanted to keep herself and Clara alive through the coming winter. She had heard about the Langston farm from a woman named Dolly Pierce at the general store, who had said in her direct, unhurried Kansas way, "Abraham Langston hires for the harvest every year. Takes on good workers, pays fair, doesn't cheat women on their wages the way some do. He's got a bunkhouse for the single men and a separate room in the barn loft that he rents to any women who come to work the fields. Decent enough man. Lost his wife some years back, keeps to himself mostly." Dolly had paused, then added, "He's got a lot of land and not enough hands. If you can work, he'll take you." Susanna could work. She had grown up on a farm in Missouri, had been working fields since she was 8 years old, knew how to swing a sickle until her arms ached and keep swinging. She was 26 years old, broad-shouldered for a woman of her slight frame, with dark auburn hair that was forever escaping its pins, green eyes the color of creek water in summer, and a jaw set with the kind of quiet determination that had been carved into her face by 18 months of surviving things that should have broken her. Her husband, Thomas Conley, had died in March, a good man taken down by a fever that moved through the farming communities of eastern Kansas like a slow-moving fire, indifferent to goodness or youth, or the fact that he had a wife 7 months pregnant and a homestead claim that required 2 sets of hands to maintain. Thomas had been 28. He had held Susanna's hand the last night and told her she was going to be all right, and she had believed him then because she'd needed to, and she had spent the month since making it true through sheer will. She had tried to keep the homestead. She had tried until the baby came, and it became impossible to work the land alone with a newborn, and the bank had not been particularly interested in the circumstances of her widowhood. They had repossessed the claim in June with paperwork that Susanna didn't fully understand, but could not afford a lawyer to fight. She had taken what she could carry, which was Clara, a carpetbag with 2 dresses and Clara's things, Thomas's old compass that she kept in her apron pocket, and the memory of a man who had loved her well and left her too soon. So now she was walking through the iron gate of the Langston farm in the early morning of the 1st of August, 1873, with Clara on her back in the wrap of linen she had fashioned into a carrier, and she was not going to feel ashamed about it. She was going to ask for work, and she was going to earn her wages, and she was going to figure out the rest. The farm was bigger than she'd expected. The main house sat at the end of a long packed dirt lane, a solid 2-story structure built from pale limestone that glowed almost white in the morning sun. To its left stood a barn that could have housed a small cavalry, red-painted boards weathered to a soft rust color. Behind the barn she could see the bunkhouse Dolly had mentioned, a long, low building with smoke already rising from its chimney despite the warm morning. And beyond all of it, running all the way to the tree line at the horizon, were the wheat fields, gold and endless and rippling. There were already men moving through the yard when Susanna came through the gate. A heavy-set man with a thick black beard was hitching a pair of draft horses to a wagon near the barn. Two younger men were sharpening tools on a whetstone beside the bunkhouse, the sound of metal on stone ringing bright in the morning air. A gray-haired woman was carrying a basket of something from the root cellar toward the house. Nobody stopped what they were doing when Susanna came in. Nobody except the man who stepped out of the barn door at that moment and stopped walking when he saw her. Abraham Langston was 32 years old and had the look of a man shaped entirely by outdoor work and years of weather. Tall and lean with broad shoulders that his work shirt did not quite contain, dark hair worn a little longer than was fashionable, and a face that was handsome in an uncalculated way. The kind of face that wasn't trying to be anything. It just was. He had dark eyes, nearly black in the morning shadow of the barn door, and they took in Susanna in one quiet, sweeping look that missed nothing: the carpetbag in her hand, the baby on her back, the dust on her boots, the set of her chin. He walked toward her without hesitating, pulling off his work gloves and tucking them in his belt. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and even, with a cadence that matched the unhurried prairie landscape around him. "You looking for Abraham Langston?" "I am," Susanna said. "I was told you're hiring for the harvest." "I am," he said. "I'm Langston." He stopped in front of her and looked at her directly, not unkindly, and then glanced at Clara, who had stopped chewing her mother's dress and was regarding Abraham with the solemn, round-eyed assessment that infants reserve for strangers. "Susanna Conley," she said. "I know you're looking at the baby and figuring the complications, Mr. Langston, so I'll just say plainly that I grew up farming. I can swing a sickle or bind sheaves or drive a wagon, whichever you need. Clara doesn't interfere with my work. I keep her close and she's a good baby. I'm asking for honest wages and the room in the barn loft that I was told you rent to women workers." Abraham looked at her for a moment. It wasn't an uncomfortable look. It was the look of a man who was thinking carefully rather than reacting quickly. "Who told you about the loft room?" he asked. "Dolly Pierce at the general store in Harding." He nodded slowly, something that might have been a smile moving briefly across his mouth. "Dolly Pierce knows more about my farm than I do," he said. "Room's empty, hasn't been used since last harvest. I'll have Mrs. Garfield get it aired out." He paused. "Wages are 50 cents a day for field work, same as I pay the men, boards included. You'll take meals with the household, not in the bunkhouse." He looked at Clara again, and this time there was something different in his eyes, something that had a softness in it that he didn't seem entirely aware of. "The baby all right?" "She's perfectly all right," Susanna said, and there was the faintest edge to it, not hostile, just the automatic guard of a woman who had fielded too many doubtful looks. "I didn't mean otherwise," he said quietly. "I just meant, is she well, not sick or anything?" Susanna felt the edge in her soften a little. "She's well. She's healthy. She's been living in a boarding house for a month and she's not complained once." Something in Abraham's face shifted and she wasn't sure what to call it. He looked at Clara one more time, and Clara reached out one small fat hand toward him with the absolute fearlessness of infants, and he raised one finger and let her grab it, and she did, wrapping her fist around it with that iron grip that 7-month-olds somehow possess. "All right, Mrs. Conley," he said. "Welcome to the Langston farm. I'll show you to Mrs. Garfield." He gently extracted his finger from Clara's grip, and Clara watched him go with great interest. "The first cut starts at dawn tomorrow. Rest today, get settled in, and be ready to work hard when the sun comes up." "I'm ready to work today," Susanna said. He turned back and looked at her, and this time the thing that moved across his face was clearly something like respect. "All right," he said. "Today then." The woman named Mrs. Garfield turned out to be exactly who Dolly Pierce might have predicted. A solid, practical widow of 60 or so, with silver hair and flour on her apron, and an expression that did its assessment quickly and without drama. She took one look at Susanna and Clara, said, "Follow me," in a voice that expected to be obeyed, and led them through the back of the house, out across the yard, and up the outside stairs on the back of the barn to the loft room. It was a single room, not large but clean and well built, with a wooden floor instead of dirt, a window that looked out over the wheat fields, a narrow iron bed, a washstand, and a small wood stove in the corner. It smelled of old hay and cedar. The late morning sun came through the window and laid itself across the floor in long gold panels. "Sheets in the trunk," Mrs. Garfield said, pointing to a wooden trunk at the foot of the bed. "Wood stacked outside the door. Meals are in the main house at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. You miss the hour, you miss the meal, though I generally leave something covered on the stove if someone's working late." She looked at Clara, who was examining a knot in the wooden wall with serious concentration. "That baby sleeping through the night, mostly," Susanna said. "She wakes once, sometimes twice." Mrs. Garfield made a sound that was neither approval nor disapproval. "There's no one below this room at night, just the horses, so she won't disturb anyone. You'll want a safe place to put her down while you work. I'll find a crate of some kind." "I manage with the wrap," Susanna said. "She rides on my back." Mrs. Garfield looked at her steadily. "In the fields, yes, she can't be on your back when you're swinging a blade." She said it not unkindly, but with the practicality of a woman who had seen too many accidents to be sentimental about it. "I'll find a crate. Line it with something soft. She can be near the edge of the field while you work. I'll check on her when I can, and the other women can take turns." She paused. "There are 2 other women this year. Maggie Holt and her sister Frances. They come every harvest. Good people." Susanna nodded. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that went deeper than the word. "Mrs." Garfield looked at her one moment longer, with the particular look of a woman who has absorbed enough of other women's suffering to recognize its weight. "You're managing just fine," she said simply, and then left. Susanna stood in the room alone with Clara for a moment. She set down her carpet bag, reached around and unslung Clara from her back, and sat down on the edge of the bed with the baby in her lap. Clara looked up at her with Thomas's eyes, which Susanna still couldn't look at without a small private ache somewhere in her ribs, and reached up to pat her mother's face. "We're going to be all right," Susanna told her, which was both a promise and a prayer. She made the bed, put away her 2 dresses, washed Clara's face at the washstand, and then put the baby back in her wrap and went back out into the golden August morning to learn the layout of the fields. She found Abraham Langston near the east fence, talking with the heavy-set bearded man she had seen earlier, who turned out to be his foreman, a taciturn Swede named Bjorn Helk, who communicated mostly in grunts and nods but apparently understood everything. Abraham was drawing something in the dirt with a stick, marking which sections would be cut first and in what order, and he didn't stop talking to Bjorn when Susanna approached, but he acknowledged her with a slight tilt of his head that said she was welcome to listen. She listened. She paid attention. She noted that the south field was to be cut first because the wheat there had ripened faster due to the way the land sat, that the cutting crew would work in rows, and the binding crew would follow behind them, that there were 8 workers in total including herself and the 2 women misses. Garfield had mentioned, plus Bjorn, 2 of Abraham's regular hands named Pete and Cal, and a young man named Jesse who had arrived the previous day from a farm 2 counties over. When Abraham finished talking to Bjorn and Bjorn moved off to inspect the cutting tools, Abraham turned to Susanna and said, without preamble, "You said you can drive a wagon." "Yes," she said. "Binding crew needs someone who can drive the wagon alongside them to collect the sheaves. It's a slow walk, not hard on the horses, but you have to pay attention to the pace and keep level with the binders. You'd still be in the field but not swinging a blade while you have the baby with you." "I can do that," she said. "And when the baby is settled, I can bind." He looked at her. "The baby goes in a safe place at the field edge. Mrs. Garfield's already arranging something." He paused. "It's not that I doubt your management of her. It's that a binding knife is sharp and the work is fast, and I've seen accidents even with experienced workers." "I understand," she said. He nodded. "Good." He looked out over the fields, and for a moment his face had a quality she had not seen in it before, a sort of private wonder, the face of a man who genuinely loved the land he worked. "It's going to be a good yield this year," he said, more to himself than to her. "Wheat's been right since May. If we get it in clean, this farm's going to have a strong winter." She looked out at the fields with him. The wheat moved in a wave and the light on it was extraordinary, the kind of late summer gold that painters were always chasing and never quite capturing. "It's beautiful," she said, without intending to say it out loud. He glanced at her, a brief sideways look, and the corner of his mouth moved. "Yes," he said, "it is." That afternoon, while the workers sharpened blades and oiled the wagon wheels and made ready for the dawn start, Susanna watched from the loft room window as Abraham Langston disappeared into the barn and did not come out for some time. She could hear the sound of wood being worked, the rhythm of a saw and then the steadier rhythm of a hammer, and she assumed it was some repair or preparation for the harvest machinery. She was nursing Clara and watching the sun go down, and she was not thinking particularly about Abraham Langston. She was thinking about the 50 cents a day she would earn starting tomorrow, and how many days the harvest would take, and whether that would be enough to rent a room through October and into November, when Mrs. Garfield appeared at the loft room door. "Mr. Langston asked me to bring this up," she said, and she stepped aside to let the thing behind her be seen. It was a cradle. A small, beautifully made wooden cradle, built from what looked like cedar plank, with a curved base for rocking and smooth jointed sides and a little hood at the top. It was simple work, but it was good work, done with care, the wood still pale and clean-smelling. There were no fancy carvings or ornamental details. It was just a cradle, solid and well-made and exactly sized for a baby of 7 months, and it was not something that had existed this morning. He had built it, this afternoon. While Susanna had been settling in and learning the field layout, he had gone into his barn and built a cradle for a woman he had met 5 hours ago. Mrs. Garfield set it down inside the door with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman delivering a practical item. He said the baby would need somewhere safe to sleep that wasn't just a bed edge, she said. He used the cedar from the off-cut pile, took him most of the afternoon. She looked at Susanna with an expression that was carefully neutral, and then her mouth softened almost imperceptibly. "He doesn't generally make announcements about things like this," she said. "He just does them." Susanna looked at the cradle for a long time after Mrs. Garfield left. She looked at it and felt something move in her chest that she was not prepared for, something that was not quite sadness and not quite gratitude and not quite anything she had a name for yet. She put Clara in it, and Clara looked up at the little cedar hood with her round Thomas eyes and made a sound of absolute satisfaction, and then she closed her eyes and went asleep, and Susanna sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hand to her mouth and breathed very carefully until she was sure she wasn't going to cry. She did not go down to thank him that evening. She told herself it was because Clara needed to be settled, and she needed an early night before the dawn start. But the truth was that she didn't trust herself to speak about it, yet, without her voice doing something she wasn't willing to let it do in front of a stranger. She thanked him at breakfast, in the plain, honest way that felt right. She came down to the main house at 6 with Clara on her hip and found herself at the long kitchen table with Mrs. Garfield, Maggie Holt and her sister Frances, Bjorn, Pete, Cal, and Jessie, and Abraham Langston at the head of the table, and she sat down across from him and said, "The cradle is a fine piece of work, Mr. Langston. It was very kind of you." He looked at her, and there was a brief quality to his attention that she might have described as startled, as though he hadn't expected to be thanked directly, or perhaps hadn't expected the directness of her. "It was nothing much," he said, "just cedar off-cut. Didn't want the little one sleeping without a safe place." "It was not nothing much," she said, quietly but firmly. He held her look for a moment, and then he nodded, a small dip of his chin that somehow felt more like a real response than many speeches she had heard. "You're welcome," he said. Maggie Holt, who was a cheerful, broad-faced woman of about 35 with sun-reddened cheeks and the easy sociability of someone who had harvested many farms in many years, smiled at Susanna across the table. "He built a shelf for my bonnet hooks 2 years ago without being asked," she said. "Just decided it was needed and built it. It's a habit of his." "Maggie," Abraham said, without inflection. "I'm just saying," Maggie said serenely and helped herself to more biscuits. Frances, her sister, was younger and quieter with the same broad-faced coloring, and she leaned across toward Clara, who was sitting on Susanna's knee examining a spoon, and said, "She's a lovely baby." "What's her name?" "Clara," Susanna said. "Hello, Clara," Frances said, and Clara rewarded her with a gum-heavy smile of such radiance that several people at the table smiled in involuntary response, including Abraham Langston, who caught himself doing it and looked down at his coffee with a thoughtful expression. The harvest began at first light. Susanna had grown up with this, with the way a harvest morning felt, the pre-dawn cold and the dew on the grass, and the sound of horses being bridled, and the low voices of workers, and the smell of coffee and sweat and cut grain that would be the smell of every day for the next 2 to 3 weeks. It lived in her body like a physical memory, something her muscles knew before her mind caught up, and when she climbed into the wagon seat and took up the reins, she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for months. This was work she knew. This was something she could do. Clara was in the cradle, which Abraham had told Bjorn to carry out and set in the shade at the northwest corner of the south field, where the lone cottonwood tree stood. Maggie had volunteered to check on her every time the binding row brought her close, and Mrs. Garfield had come out at the start with a serious expression and the authority of a woman who was personally taking charge of the situation. Clara had been placed in the shade of the cottonwood in her cradle, examined the leaves above her with deep interest, and made no complaints. Susanna drove the wagon. She learned the pace quickly, that particular slow walking speed that matched the binders, the way she had to watch not just the horse but the line of workers to her left, to anticipate when they would pause and when they would move. It required the kind of sustained sideways attention that was tiring in a specific way, but she had always been good at holding multiple things at once, and by mid-morning she had found the rhythm. Abraham worked the cutting crew. She could see him in the line, his sickle moving in the steady arcing sweep of a man who had done this for years, and the cut wheat fell in clean rows behind him. He worked hard and without showmanship, the kind of worker who was simply always doing the right thing at the right moment, and she noticed, as the morning went on, that he checked on Clara whenever the cutting line brought him past the cottonwood corner, a brief glance that wasn't trying to be noticed. She noticed it anyway. At the noon meal break, they ate in the shade of the wagon, bread and salt beef and cold coffee and apple pie that Mrs. Garfield had sent out in a covered basket, and Susanna nursed Clara behind the wagon wheel and then laid her back in the cradle, and sat with Maggie and Frances in the long grass eating, and listening to Maggie talk about the harvest 2 years ago when a storm had come up so fast that they had barely gotten the cut grain under cover. "Lost about 40 sheaves in the east field," Maggie said. Abraham didn't say a word about it, just started picking up what could be saved and restacking it. Some men would have cursed the sky for a week. He just worked. Susanna was quiet, pulling a piece of dry grass through her fingers. "He's a good man," Frances said simply. "I've gathered that," Susanna said, and she meant it without any particular significance, but something in her voice must have had a color to it, because Maggie looked at her sideways with the look of a woman who has noticed something and is too wise to name it yet. In the afternoon, Bjorn came to take the wagon for a supply run, and Susanna went into the cutting line. She had asked to bind, and Abraham had handed her a binding knife with a look that was evaluating but not doubting. She had taken it and gone to work, and she had kept pace with the line from the first sheaf, her hands moving through the familiar motions of gathering and twisting, and tying with the ease of deep muscle memory. She was 3 rows in when she was aware of Abraham falling into the line one place over from her, not close enough to crowd, just close enough to be nearby. He said nothing. He worked, but there was a quality to his nearness that she was conscious of in a way she hadn't been conscious of anyone's physical presence since Thomas died, and the recognition of that consciousness made her work harder for about 20 minutes until it settled into something she could simply accept as background information. Toward the end of the afternoon, when the light had gone amber and the shadows of the wheat stalks stretched long across the cut rows, he said, without looking up from his work, "You've harvested before." "All my life," she said. "I grew up on a farm in Missouri. My father grew corn mostly, some wheat. I've been cutting grain since I was tall enough to swing a sickle without it being a hazard." He absorbed this. "Good workers aren't always easy to find for harvest time," he said. "I've had people who said they could do this work and couldn't." "I told you what I can do accurately," she said. "I don't have the luxury of overselling myself." There was a pause in which the sickles swept and the wheat fell. "No," he said quietly. "I imagine you don't." It wasn't pity. She had learned to tell the difference. It was acknowledgement, and she accepted it without deflecting it. That night, after supper and after Clara was asleep in her cedar cradle, Susanna sat by the window of the loft room and wrote a letter to her mother in Missouri by the light of the oil lamp. She described the farm in some detail, the size of it, the wheat fields, the quality of the work. She wrote about Mrs. Garfield and Maggie and Frances. She described Clara's adaptation to the new surroundings. And then she sat for a moment with the pen over the paper and she wrote, almost without deciding to. "There is a man here who built a cradle for Clara before the first day was done without being asked. He is a good man, I think. I will tell you more when I know more." She folded the letter, addressed it, and set it aside to send with the next supply run to Harding. Then she blew out the lamp and lay down in the narrow iron bed, and in the darkness she touched Thomas's compass in her apron pocket, which she had put on the washstand, and she lay still and thought about the particular gentleness of a man who saw what was needed and simply did it. The days of the harvest fell into a rhythm that Susanna found deeply stabilizing, the kind of routine that required enough physical effort that the mind was too occupied to spiral into grief or worry, but not so brutal that there was no room for other things. She rose before dawn, nursed Clara, brought her down to breakfast in the main house, worked the fields from first light to last light with a break at noon, and in the evening sat with Mrs. Garfield and Maggie and Frances in the kitchen while the men were in the bunkhouse, and they talked about ordinary things, the weather, the wheat, Maggie's opinions about the best way to make a harvest pie, Frances's quiet ambitions to someday own a small dairy farm of her own. Abraham came to the kitchen most evenings for a while, which Mrs. Garfield had told Susanna was his habit since his wife had died. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and sometimes talked and sometimes just read, and Susanna came to understand that this was a man who was comfortable with the company of people without needing to perform for them, which was a quality she found easier to be around than most. His wife had been named Eliza. Mrs. Garfield mentioned her name on the third evening with the natural ease of someone who has processed her grief and arrived at a place where memory can be held without being avoided. "She died 5 years ago," she said. "Fever, same as takes so many out here. Abraham was 27. They'd been married 3 years. Never had children, which I think he still carries the weight of, though he doesn't speak of it." Susanna was quiet. "He built this house for her," Mrs. Garfield added, with the particular pride of someone who loved the person who'd done the building. "Every room in it. Spent a year on it before he asked her to marry him. He wanted to have somewhere worthy to bring her home to." Susanna looked at her hands in her lap. "I'm not telling you this to start anything," Mrs. Garfield said, with a practical clarity that made Susanna blink. "I'm just saying it so you understand the kind of man he is." "I appreciate that," Susanna said carefully. Mrs. Garfield looked at her, then at Clara asleep in the cradle that had been moved to a corner of the kitchen, and then back at Susanna. "Thomas Conley," she said. "Was he a good man?" "He was," Susanna said, and her voice did not waver, though something beneath it did. "He was very good. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Garfield said simply. Not elaborately, not with the drawn-out sympathy that Susanna had learned to brace herself against. Just simply sorry, which was the kind that landed truest. "Thank you," Susanna said, and meant that in the deepest way too. On the 5th day of the harvest, something happened that shifted the quality of things between Susanna and Abraham, not dramatically, but with the specific significance of a hinge turning. She had been driving the wagon along the east section of the north field in the late afternoon, and the wagon wheel had found a rut she hadn't seen, the kind left by the previous year's harvest that the dry summer had hardened to near stone. The wagon lurched, the left wheel dropped into it at an angle that sent the load of sheaves sliding, and Susanna had the horses stopped and the brake set before the load fully tipped, but the momentum carried the front sheaves off the wagon edge anyway, and she had climbed down to assess the damage. The wheel was fine. The sheaves were in the field. The horses were annoyed. Susanna was considering the logistics of getting the load restacked alone when Abraham arrived at her left shoulder, appearing out of the wheat rows with his sickle still in hand, having seen it from the cutting line. "Anyone hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. "Just sheaves down. The wheel is sound." He set the sickle in the wagon, and without further conversation began lifting sheaves and handing them up to her as she restacked the load. They worked together with the wordless efficiency of two people who had both done enough physical work to know how it coordinated between hands without needing to negotiate it. She climbed up, he handed, she stacked, and the load was reset in about 7 minutes, and when she looked down from the wagon at him, he had wheat chaff in his dark hair and a line of sweat across his forehead, and he was looking up at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded. It was only a moment. Just an unguarded moment. The way he was looking at her, without any of the deliberate neutrality he generally maintained, and in that moment she could see clearly that he was not indifferent to her, and the clarity of that knowledge landed in her chest in a way that was warm and confused and alarming all at once. "Thank you," she said. "Of course," he said, and the guardedness came back naturally, not unkindly, just the closing of something that had briefly been open. He picked up his sickle and went back to the cutting line. She sat on the wagon seat and picked up the reins and let out a long, slow breath, and then she drove. That evening, after supper, when the kitchen had been cleared and Mrs. Garfield had taken herself off to bed and Maggie and Frances had gone back to the room they shared in the house, Susanna stayed at the table to feed Clara her last meal of the evening, and Abraham was still at the table with his coffee. It was quiet. The kind of late August evening quiet that was full of crickets and the far distant sound of the night wind in the wheat. Clara nursed with her usual absorption, and Susanna was watching the lamp flame and not talking, and after a time Abraham said, "How long were you and your husband married?" She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup, not at her, which made the question feel less like an intrusion and more like conversation. 3 years, she said. "We married when I was 23. "I was married 3 years too," he said. "Eliza, I know," she said. "Mrs. Garfield told me. I hope that's all right." "Mrs. Garfield tells everyone everything," he said, and there was warmth in it rather than complaint. "She's not wrong to. It's not a secret." He paused. "He was a good man, your husband." "He was," she said. "He was kind and he worked hard and he loved Clara even though he never got to meet her." She paused. "He used to talk to my stomach every evening," she said, "tell the baby about the farm and the plans he had for it, how the fields were going to look when they were right. I used to tease him about it. I wish now I'd just let him talk as long as he wanted." Abraham was quiet for a moment and then he said very quietly, "Yes, there are things like that." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight and she said gently, "Did you and Eliza want children?" A long pause, not a painful one, just an honest one. "Very much," he said. "It didn't happen. We had 5 years before she got sick and then we didn't. And then she was gone." He looked at his hands. "I've wondered sometimes if the wanting of it shaped the farm more than anything else. All this space, all these fields. I think I kept expanding because some part of me was planning for people to fill it." The honesty of that landed quietly between them. Susanna looked at Clara, who had finished nursing and was now lying in Susanna's arms looking at the lamp with the dreamy half-awake expression of a baby approaching sleep. "Clara has your late husband's eyes," Abraham said, "or so I assume. She doesn't have your eyes." She looked up, surprised that he'd noticed. "His eyes," she confirmed. "He had the most extraordinary brown eyes, very dark. She got them exactly." He looked at Clara, and his expression was the same one she had caught in that unguarded moment on the wagon, something warm and entirely undefended, and she felt it again in her chest, that complicated warmth she didn't quite have the language for yet. "She's a remarkable little person," he said. "She is," Susanna said. "She has been remarkable since the day she arrived, which was inconvenient timing and a lot of chaos, and she was just very calm about the whole thing." He smiled. A real one, wide enough to change his whole face, and it was the first time she had seen it fully, and it was devastating in the best possible way. "That's a good quality," he said. "Being calm about inconvenient timing." "It is," she said. "I'm trying to learn it from her." He looked at her, still with the smile at the edges, and said, "I don't think you're doing badly." The second week of the harvest brought a 2-day stretch of brutal heat that slowed the work and shortened everyone's temper except Clara's, who appeared to regard the heat as simply another interesting atmospheric condition. The temperature climbed into the hundreds, the kind of scorching Kansas August heat that pressed down from a sky white rather than blue, and the workers took longer noon breaks and started earlier in the mornings to get the most out of the cooler hours. On the first hot afternoon, while the workers rested and the horses stood in the shade, and even the wheat seemed to pause, Susanna brought Clara to the shade of the cottonwood at the field edge and sat against its trunk with her legs extended and Clara in her lap. And Abraham appeared out of the field and dropped down in the grass beside the tree with his hat over his face, which was what every sensible person in Kansas did at 2 in the afternoon in August. They lay there in companionable silence for some time, and Clara crawled from Susanna's lap to Abraham's without any particular awareness that this might require permission, and Abraham, hat still over his face, reached out one hand and steadied her automatically, and Clara sat on his stomach and slapped his hat with both hands with great glee. "Clara," Susanna said. "She's fine," Abraham said from under the hat. He lifted one edge of it and looked at Clara, who was now attempting to stand on his stomach, which was a project requiring more balance than she had. "Ambitious," he observed. "Always," Susanna said. He sat up slightly, hat in hand now, and held Clara upright with both hands around her middle while she did her standing project, which was her current primary physical goal in life. Clara stood, wobbled, laughed, sat down with a plop, and immediately tried again. "She's going to walk soon," he said. "She's been trying to stand for 3 weeks, Susanna agreed. "I give her about another 3 to 4 weeks before she's off, and I won't be able to put her down anymore." He smiled at Clara, who had achieved a brief stable stand and was utterly triumphant about it. "Good timing," he said. "Harvest will be done by then." Susanna watched him with her daughter and felt something shift under her, a slow tectonic kind of shift, the kind that changes the landscape permanently but quietly. He was not performing anything. He was just a man sitting in the grass holding a baby upright because she wanted to stand, and the absolute naturalness of it was the thing that undid her more than anything else could have. "You would have been a good father," she said, before she could decide whether to say it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said softly, "I hope I still get the chance." He didn't look at her when he said it. He was watching Clara, who had sat down again and was examining his fingers with great scientific interest. But the words were there, in the hot August air under the cottonwood, and Susanna sat with them and let them be there. On the 12th day of the harvest, Maggie Holt did what Maggie Holt apparently did, according to Frances, who told Susanna about it afterward with fond exasperation. Maggie went to Abraham Langston directly and told him that he was looking at Susanna Conley the way a plant looks at water, and that he should do something about it before Susanna finished her harvest work and moved on to somewhere else. And he spent the next 5 years being stoically sad about it, the way he'd been stoically sad about everything since Eliza. Frances told this to Susanna on the back steps of the main house, while Clara crawled through the dust at their feet examining pebbles. And Susanna sat very still for a moment and then said, "What did he say?" "He said," Frances reported with the specific pleasure of a younger sister relaying information, "I appreciate your concern, Maggie," and then he went and checked on the south field cutting. "Oh," said Susanna. "And then," Frances added, "he came back in about 20 minutes and said, 'She hasn't given me any indication.' And Maggie said, 'Abraham, you enormous fool, she thanked you for a cradle like it was the most significant thing anyone had ever done for her, because it was.' And then he went back out to the south field again." Susanna was quiet for a long moment. "I am not telling you this to cause trouble," Frances said seriously. "I'm telling you because Maggie's going to do worse things if left unmanaged, and I thought you should know the landscape." "The landscape," Susanna repeated. "He's a good man," Frances said, which was the same thing she had said 2 weeks ago and which Susanna now had 14 days of evidence for. "I know," Susanna said. "And you're a good woman," Frances said. "And Clara is a wonderful baby." "I know that too," Susanna said, and despite herself she was smiling. That evening Abraham Langston came to the barn stairs and knocked on the door of the loft room, which he had not done before in the 2 weeks she had been there. Susanna opened it with Clara on her hip and looked at him standing on the narrow landing in the blue evening light, hat in his hands, and something about his expression was different from the careful composure she had come to know. It was more open, more uncertain. "May I speak with you?" he asked. "Come in," she said. He stepped into the room and stood near the window and did not sit down, which told her that whatever he was going to say he needed to be upright for it. She sat on the edge of the bed with Clara and waited. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly because I think you are a person who prefers plain speaking." "I am," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I know you're a widow of 5 months and you have a baby and you're here to work and earn wages and you have things to figure out and a life to build, and I'm not trying to complicate any of that," he said. "But I've been thinking, very much more than I should, about you." He stopped, seeming to weigh what he was doing, and then continued. "I don't say this to create a burden or an expectation. I say it because I think honesty deserves more respect than silence, and because, if you have no feelings of any similar kind, I would like to know that, so I can put myself back in order." The room was very quiet except for Clara, who was chewing on the hem of Susanna's apron with committed devotion. Susanna looked at Abraham Langston standing at her window in the blue evening light with his hat in his hands, and she thought about the cradle he had built before the first day was done, and about his hand steadying Clara in the field, and about the way he had said, "I hope I still get the chance," and about 5 months of carrying herself through the world alone, and about the feeling that had been growing in her chest since the moment she had arrived at this farm. That slow warming that she had been watching with caution and hadn't dared name. "You should know," she said carefully, "that I loved Thomas very much, and that is not a thing I will pretend otherwise about." "I know," he said, "and I'm not asking you to. And I am not an easy person to be with," she said. "I have opinions about most things and I will not be quiet about them, and I have a 7-month-old who wakes in the night and puts pebbles in her mouth." "I've noticed all of that," he said, and the very faintest smile was there. "And I don't know what comes next for me," she said. "I don't have a plan beyond the end of harvest. I have wages and I have options and I'm still figuring out what they are." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "Abraham," she said, and saying his first name for the first time out loud was its own distinct moment, and she saw the slight change in his face when she said it. "The cradle you built Clara on the first day. Do you know what that did to me?" He shook his head. "It made me feel," she said carefully, "like someone had seen what was needed and decided that it mattered, without being asked, without any obligation. You just saw it and did it." She paused. "I have been alone with a baby for 5 months in a way that I will not overdramatize but also will not pretend was easy, and you built my daughter a cradle before I had been on your farm for a full day, and it has mattered to me every single day since." He was very still, listening to her with the quality of absolute attention that was one of the things she had come to value most in him. "So," she said, "when you ask whether I have feelings of any similar kind, yes, I do. They're new, and I am handling them carefully, because I think that's the only responsible way to handle new feelings when you are in my situation. But yes." The relief and something much warmer that moved through his face in that moment was the most unguarded she had ever seen him, and it made him look younger and purely happy in a way that made her heart contract. "All right," he said, very quietly. "All right," she said. He stayed for about an hour. They sat at the small table by the window, and Mrs. Garfield brought up coffee without being asked, which told Susanna that Mrs. Garfield had known exactly what was going to happen this evening. Clara fell asleep in her cradle. The night insects sang outside the window. They talked, really talked, about things beyond the harvest, about his plans for the farm, about her childhood in Missouri, about Thomas and about Eliza, both of them, openly and without the stiff awkwardness that such conversations might have carried, because they were two people who had both learned that loss was a part of the story, not a prohibition against continuing it. When he left, he paused at the door and looked at her. "I'd like to call on you properly," he said. "Take a ride on Sunday if the weather holds, if that seems right to you." "It seems right," she said. He nodded. He put his hat on, and she thought briefly that a man putting his hat on while standing in a doorway was somehow one of the most purely Western things a person could do. And then he went down the barn stairs, and she listened to his footsteps crossing the yard, and she sat at the table for a long time, not thinking very clearly about anything in particular, just sitting in a feeling that she hadn't had in a long time, and was afraid to name directly in case naming it too soon made it fragile. The Sunday ride happened on the second Sunday of August, and it was everything a Sunday afternoon ride on a Kansas prairie in late summer could be, which was a great deal. He hitched the lighter wagon, the two-seat one with the spring suspension, and put a blanket in the bed for Clara, and they drove out across the property to where the land rose slightly to a long, low ridge from which you could see the whole sweep of the farm and the river winding through the lower fields, and the town of Harding a pale smudge on the horizon to the east. They sat on the ridge for 2 hours and talked, and ate the food Mrs. Garfield had packed with the thoroughness of a woman who took full advantage of opportunities she had helped create. Clara crawled through the grass on the blanket and found a caterpillar and examined it with the seriousness of a naturalist, and Abraham watched her with a gentleness that was no longer something Susanna had to discover in small glimpses, but was simply there, available and unguarded, as natural to him as his own hands. He told her about buying the land when he was 22 with money saved from 2 years of hiring out as a hand on other farms. He told her about the first winter, which had nearly broken him, alone in a one-room cabin that is now the root cellar, ice on the inside of the walls, living on cornmeal and dried beef, and the absolute determination not to fail at the thing he had decided to build. He told her about meeting Eliza at a church social in Harding when he was 24, about knowing from the first conversation that she was the person he wanted to build this farm with, about the 3 years of their marriage which he described as the best years of his life, and the 5 years since her death as necessary ones, years of building and learning and growing into himself, but years he would not have chosen. "You've been alone a long time," Susanna said. "Yes," he said, "but I haven't been unhappy. I want to be clear about that. There's a difference between lonely and unhappy, and I've never given in to unhappy. The farm doesn't allow it." "No," she agreed, "it doesn't." The loneliness was manageable, he said, until it started to feel like a habit, and habits are harder to shift than feelings. She understood that completely. She was quiet for a moment, watching Clara, who had abandoned the caterpillar and was now attempting to eat grass, which Susanna gently redirected. "I need to think about where I go when harvest is done," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I have wages, I have some options. I could go back to Missouri, my mother is there. I could find work in Harding for the winter. I'm not in a crisis." She paused. "I'm just not settled." He was quiet beside her. "I'm not telling you that as a way of saying anything about this," she said. "I'm just saying it because you deserve to know the state of things." He turned and looked at her. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "I want to say that without any pressure attached to it, because I understand it's a large thing to say and you've been here barely 2 weeks. But I'm saying it because it's true, and you know I prefer plainness. I'd like you and Clara to stay on at the farm. There's room here, and there's work here that needs doing year-round, and Mrs. Garfield would tell you herself she's been wanting help in the house for 2 years." He paused. "And beyond all of that, I would like you to stay because I would like the chance to know you more." Susanna looked at him for a long time, with the late August sun in both their faces and the prairie wind moving through the grass and Clara making determined sounds at a rock she had found. "I'm not ready to make any large decisions," she said. "Not yet." "I know," he said, "but I'll stay through September," she said, "to see how things stand." He nodded slowly, and the quiet satisfaction in his face was not small. "Abraham," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment, at the angles of his face and the darkness of his eyes and the particular quality he had of being entirely present wherever he was, and then she said, "You're a good man. I've been thinking it for 2 weeks, and I thought you should know I've arrived at it conclusively." He blinked once and then he laughed, which was a sound she hadn't heard before, a genuine surprised laugh, and it was the most attractive thing about him so far, and that was a high standard to beat. "Mrs. Conley," he said, and she heard the warmth in the formal address, the affection underneath it. "You're something else entirely." "I've been told," she said, and she was smiling fully now, the kind of smiling that she hadn't done without effort for a long time. September came in cooler and golden, the harvest completed, and the yield exactly as good as Abraham had predicted. The grain stored and the fields resting, and the farm settling into the between-season work that required fewer hands but no less attention. Maggie and Frances returned to their own lives, Maggie departing with the energy of someone who had accomplished things beyond just the harvest work, and Frances with a quiet warm hug for Susanna and a pressed kiss to Clara's forehead. Susanna stayed. She moved from the barn loft room into a proper guest room in the main house at Mrs. Garfield's insistence. "The loft room is no place to spend a Kansas September. It'll be cold up there, and the wood stove isn't sufficient. And besides, the house has 4 bedrooms and only one of them is being used." And Susanna accepted this with the full understanding that Mrs. Garfield was managing the situation with tremendous professional skill. The September work was different from the harvest. It was steadier and slower, repairing fences, preparing the root cellar for winter stores, bringing in the kitchen garden produce, tending to the livestock through the cooling days. Abraham and Bjorn and Pete and Cal, who stayed on as permanent hands, worked the heavier maintenance, and Susanna worked with Mrs. Garfield in the kitchen and garden and house, and in the afternoons when the lighter work allowed it, they had time. Time was different from harvest time. Harvest time left no room for anything but the work. September time had evenings that stretched long and golden before they turned cold, evenings that could be spent on the porch talking, or riding the ridge, or sitting in the kitchen while Clara pulled herself upright against every available piece of furniture in her ongoing campaign toward walking. Clara took her first independent steps on the 14th of September, 3 steps across the kitchen floor from the table leg to Abraham's outstretched hands, and the expression on his face was something Susanna stored away as one of the images she knew she would carry for the rest of her life, pure, unfiltered joy. The kind that doesn't calculate how it looks, the kind that just is. "She walked," he said, looking up at Susanna, and his voice had the quality of someone who had just witnessed something remarkable. "She walked," Susanna confirmed, and her voice was thick in a way she didn't try to hide. Mrs. Garfield, who had been watching from the stove, said, "About time," in a tone that somehow conveyed enormous pride. Clara stood in Abraham's hands, swaying triumphantly, and then sat down hard and looked incredibly pleased with herself. In mid-September, a letter arrived from Susanna's mother in Missouri, responding to the letter Susanna had sent from the harvest's first week. Her mother was a practical woman named Ruth who had raised 3 children on a Missouri farm and survived the Civil War years and was not given to sentiment. But the letter had in it, near the end, a paragraph that Susanna read twice. "You say this man built a cradle for Clara before the first day was done. Susanna, your father built a rocking horse for your brother the afternoon of the day he was born, before he'd even held him, because he said the boy would need one eventually, and he might as well do it now. I recognized something in your father the moment I heard about that horse. I expect you know what I'm saying to you." Susanna folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket with Thomas's compass and sat for a while with both of those objects in her hand. That evening, she went looking for Abraham and found him at the fence line at the west end of the property, replacing a post that had healed over in the summer's dry ground. She walked out to him and he straightened and looked at her, reading something in her face before she said anything. She told him about the letter. She read him her mother's paragraph. He was very still. "I need you to know something," she said. "I am not offering you something carelessly. I have a daughter who is the most important thing in my life, and I carry the memory of a man I loved, and those things are not going anywhere. But I have been here 6 weeks, and every single day I have seen more clearly who you are, and what I feel when I am around you is not something I'm going to walk away from because I'm afraid of feeling it." He set down the fence post and turned fully toward her. "I'm telling you that I am in love with you," she said plainly, because she had told him she preferred plain speaking and she owed him the same. "Or I am becoming it very rapidly, and I expect to arrive there fully very soon. And I thought you should know." For a long moment he simply looked at her, and the open quality of his face was everything she had come to love in him, the man who did not perform anything, who was simply and entirely himself. Then he stepped forward and took her face in his hands, carefully, the way a person holds something they are afraid of damaging and determined to keep safe, and he kissed her once, with a quietness and a tenderness that said more than any speech could have. And when he pulled back she could see in his eyes the same thing she felt in her chest, that wide-open fullness of something that had come back from a long distance and arrived home. "I am already there," he said. "I arrived there some time ago." She laughed, which turned into something that was also a little bit crying, which she didn't try to prevent, and he pulled her close with his arms around her, and she pressed her face into his shoulder and breathed in the smell of him, wood and wheat and honest outdoor work. And she thought that maybe the compass in her pocket had been pointing here all along, and she just hadn't had the map to see it. He asked her to marry him on the 1st of October, on the ridge where they had driven on their first Sunday ride, at sunset, which painted the Kansas sky in colors that no one had ever named adequately and no one ever would. He had made no grand ceremony of it, no ring produced from a pocket, which Susanna later teased him about, to which he responded earnestly that he would have one made in Harding the very next week, which he did. He simply said, "I would like to marry you, Susanna. I want to make a life with you and Clara on this farm, and I want to do that fully with a marriage, not just a proximity to each other. I am asking you clearly and honestly because that's the only way I know to ask." She said yes with the same clarity and without hesitation, because she was a woman who, when she arrived at a conclusion, arrived fully, and she had arrived at Abraham Langston several weeks ago. They were married in Harding on the 3rd Saturday of October, 1873, at the Methodist church that Susanna had attended not once previously in her life, but which had an excellent minister named Reverend Holt, who turned out to be Maggie Holt's husband, which made the wedding party feel more like a reunion than a ceremony. Maggie herself arrived in her best dress with her arms full of autumn flowers that she had cut from her kitchen garden, dahlias and late-season sunflowers and dried wheat stalks bundled with orange ribbon, and she stood in the front pew with an expression of complete satisfaction that she had earned and knew it. Mrs. Garfield was there, in a good gray dress with her silver hair pinned properly, and she cried, which she would have denied if anyone had mentioned it. Bjorn, Pete, and Cal were there in their best shirts, looking profoundly uncomfortable with ceremony but present and honest about their attendance. And Frances had come back from her own farm life for the day, small and bright-faced in the October sunshine, standing beside her sister with flowers in her hands. Susanna wore her better dress, the blue one she had brought in the carpetbag that she had saved for good occasions, which it turned out she had been right to save. She had put her hair up properly for the first time in months, and the auburn of it caught the October light coming through the church windows, and Abraham, who had been standing at the altar looking at the door with the particular expression of a man waiting for someone very important, went very still when she came in, and then his face did the thing it did, that complete unguarded open expression, and she walked to him smiling. Clara sat on Mrs. Garfield's knee in the front pew, in a white dress that Mrs. Garfield had made in secret over the past 3 weeks, and she spent the ceremony trying to pull the flowers out of Maggie's bouquet and was only occasionally successful. And when the minister declared Abraham and Susanna man and wife and Abraham kissed his bride, Clara made a sound of enthusiastic approval that made the whole church laugh. The winter that followed was the first winter Susanna had not been afraid in 2 years. It was a hard one, as Kansas winters were, with 2 significant snowstorms in December and a stretch of bitter cold in January that kept everyone close to the house and the fires burning high. But the root cellar was full, and the grain was stored, and the livestock were healthy in the farmhouse, which Abraham had built room by room with his own hands for a life he had not yet stopped hoping for, held the warmth in the way that a well-built house does, with the particular quality of something made with intention. She learned the house fully that winter, all its habits and personalities, the window in the kitchen that let in the west wind if you didn't latch it properly, the second stair from the top that always creaked, the way the afternoon sun came through the parlor window and fell across the braided rug in a stripe that moved as the season changed. She learned Abraham fully too, his early rising and his late evenings over the farm accounts, his habit of working through problems with his hands busy even when his mind was the thing occupied, his quietness when he was tired, and the way a good meal or a good piece of news could expand the warmth in him until it filled the whole room. He learned her too, her opinions, which were many and strongly held, her way of thinking through decisions from multiple angles before arriving at one, which was the opposite of his own direct processing, and which he came to value because it caught things he missed. Her grief, which lived quietly inside her daily life, surfacing sometimes at unexpected moments, and which he met every time with the same steady presence, neither minimizing it nor making it larger than it needed to be, just sitting with her in it until it passed. One evening in January, with snow pressing against the windows and Clara asleep in her room, which was now the small bedroom at the top of the stairs that Abraham had repainted a soft yellow, Susanna sat in the parlor with Thomas's compass in her palm. Abraham sat down beside her on the settee and looked at it. He knew what it was. She had told him. "May I?" he asked. She put it in his hand. He held it, feeling the weight of it, and the needle swung to north the way it always did. "He would have liked this farm," Susanna said. "Thomas, he would have looked at what you've built here, and he would have said something generous and genuine about it." Abraham turned the compass carefully. "I hope I'm worthy of the life he left you to make," he said. She looked at him. "You are," she said. "He would have known it." Abraham gave the compass back to her, and she held it for a moment, and then she put it in the small wooden box on the parlor shelf where she kept Clara's first curl and the dried petals of the wedding flowers, the box where the things that mattered were kept. She put it there, not away, but in its proper place among the other true things. "Abraham," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think I'm with child," she said. He turned to look at her. The snow pressed at the windows and the fire moved in the grate, and outside the Kansas winter did its ancient, indifferent work. And inside this house that had been built for a life still being made, Abraham Langston looked at his wife, and his face was the most fully open she had ever seen it, an expression of happiness so straightforward it was almost devastating. "Are you sure?" he asked, very quietly. "Not entirely yet," she said, "but mostly." He took her hand in both of his and held it, not speaking, and she could feel the trembling in him that he was containing, and she thought that this was love, not the falling part but the continuing part, the sitting together in the quiet when the news is so large that words are not enough for it, the holding of hands in the winter dark while the world outside does its work, and inside the fire burns and the future leans in clothes. Spring came. Susanna's pregnancy confirmed itself with the confident certainty of second pregnancies, and the farm moved into its planting work, the fields broken and prepared and seeded under the April sun. Clara walked everywhere now with the unstoppable confidence of a 14-month-old who had recently mastered stairs, and Bjorn, who had never in Susanna's observation been demonstrably interested in anything not related to farm equipment, had begun following her around with a protectiveness that was purely involuntary, and which Pete and Cal ribbed him about relentlessly. Susanna worked the spring work at a measured pace, which Abraham monitored with a combination of respect for her judgment and a barely suppressed anxiety that she found endearing. She felt well, genuinely, with the particular physical vigor that had characterized her first pregnancy too, the kind that made her feel capable of most things if not the extreme end of them. She was not riding horses or hefting grain sacks. She was planting kitchen garden and managing the accounts and driving the light wagon when needed, and she was fine. "You don't need to watch me that way," she told Abraham one afternoon in May when she caught him watching her from the barn door while she worked the kitchen garden. "I'm watching the garden," he said. "You're watching me," she said. "I'm all right." He came over from the barn door and crouched down beside the row she was working and said, very seriously, "I know you're all right. I know you're capable and strong and you've done harder things than I've asked of you here. I just also—" He stopped. "You're afraid," she said gently. He was quiet for a moment. "The fever takes people," he said. "I've seen it, and birth itself." He paused. "Eliza didn't die in childbirth, but I've known women who did, and He stopped again. She put down her trowel and put her hand against his face, and he leaned into it, the way he always did, with that specific quality of leaning that said he was a man who had learned not to need things and was still getting used to being allowed to need them. "I'm going to be all right," she said. "I've done this before and I'm going to be all right." "I know," he said. "But it's all right to be afraid," she said. "You don't have to not be afraid. You just don't have to let it change how you're with me." He turned his face and pressed his lips to her palm, just once, and it was not a theatrical gesture, it was just real, and she felt it all the way through. The baby came in September, the same month that the harvest began, which was not entirely convenient but which the baby was apparently not interested in scheduling around. It was a boy, born on the 8th of September, 1874, with a set of lungs that announced himself to the whole farm and quite possibly the county. And Abraham, who had been pacing the kitchen floor below for 4 hours, came up to the bedroom when Mrs. Garfield called him, and stood in the doorway looking at Susanna in the bed with the baby in her arms, and made no attempt whatsoever to contain what was happening on his face. Susanna, exhausted and entirely certain and completely whole, held the baby up slightly and said, "Come and meet your son." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby and then at Susanna with an expression so undefended that she thought she might remember it perfectly until the day she died. "He's so small," Abraham said, in the stunned way of men encountering newborns. "He weighs 8 pounds, Mrs. Garfield said from the corner with authority. "He's not small, he's appropriate." "He's perfect," Susanna said. Abraham put out his finger and the baby, following the ancient reflex, grabbed it with his fist, and the expression on Abraham's face then was not something that Susanna had words for. It was the face of a man whose deepest longing had been answered, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. They named him Thomas James Langston. Thomas for Susanna's first husband, the good man who should still be in the world, and James for Abraham's father, who had died when Abraham was 12. Abraham had suggested Thomas without being asked, the first night after the birth when they were alone in the room with the baby sleeping between them, and Susanna had looked at him with the full force of what that generosity meant to her. "Are you sure?" she had asked. "He was your husband," Abraham said simply. "He was Clara's father. He should be in the boy's name." She had put her head against his shoulder and not said anything for a while, which was its own kind of answer. Clara met her brother the morning after he arrived, brought in by Mrs. Garfield, who held her up at the bedside, and Clara looked at the baby with an expression of intense suspicion followed by cautious interest. And then she patted his head with one hand, very gently, which was as close to a welcome as a 14-month-old was equipped to give. The harvest of 1874 was done with Susanna at the accounts, and Maggie and Francis back in the fields, and Abraham driving the cutting crew with the same steady, hard-working efficiency as always. And Thomas James slept in the cedar cradle in whatever room his mother was in. The same cradle built before the first day was done, which was beginning to feel like something of a legend on the Langston farm. Told by Maggie every harvest after as the story that explained everything worth knowing about Abraham Langston. The years that followed built themselves one on another with the specific unhurried richness of a life being well lived. The farm grew. Abraham bought the adjoining 60 acres in 1875, which doubled the wheat fields and required hiring Bjorn's brother Carl as a second foreman. And Carl arrived from Sweden with a wife named Astrid and 4 children, which made the Langston farm feel considerably more populated than it had been in the years of Abraham's solitary building. Clara grew into a child of remarkable independence and fierce, bright intelligence, with her father Thomas's dark eyes and Susanna's auburn hair, and a personality that was entirely her own, opinionated and curious, and kind in equal measure. She followed Abraham everywhere by the time she could keep up with him, asking questions with the unrelenting thoroughness of a child who will not accept vague answers, and Abraham answered every question with the same seriousness he gave anything that mattered to him, which made her trust him in a way that built slowly and completely. One afternoon when Clara was 3, she asked Abraham, with the directness of a small child who has not yet learned to soften questions, "Are you my papa now?" Abraham crouched down to her level, and his expression was careful and loving and completely honest, and he said, "Your papa was a very good man named Thomas, and he loved you before you were even born. He's not here with us, but he's real and he's yours, and you should always know that." He paused. "And I love you, and I'm here, and you can call me whatever feels right to you." Clara thought about this with the gravity of a 3-year-old processing important information. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied, and said, "Okay, Papa," and went back to the project she'd been doing before, which was attempting to teach Thomas James, who was just past 1 year old and deeply devoted to following his sister, how to pat a horse properly. Susanna, who had been listening from the porch, put her hand over her mouth and breathed very carefully. Abraham stood up and looked over at her, and she shook her head slightly, meaning she was fine, she was more than fine, and he crossed the yard to the porch and stood with her a moment in the afternoon sun, and she leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her and they watched their children in the yard together. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he asked. "For loving her the way you do." He was quiet for a moment. "It didn't require effort," he said. "She's Clara." The second harvest after their marriage, Jesse, the young man from 2 counties over who had come for the harvest in 1873, returned with a wife of his own, a quick-eyed woman from Oklahoma named Helen, who Susanna took to immediately. And they worked a fine harvest, and Jesse and Abraham spent the evenings in the kitchen talking about land and wheat futures, and the state of the Kansas cattle trade with the absorbed intensity of 2 men who genuinely loved the work they did. In 1876, Susanna's mother Ruth came from Missouri for a visit that was intended to be 2 weeks and stretched to 3 months. Because once Ruth Conley arrived at the Langston farm and saw it with her own eyes, she seemed to decide it was worth staying to understand properly. She was a small, direct woman with Susanna's green eyes and a more severe version of her jaw, and she sat in the kitchen with Mrs. Garfield for the first 3 days in a conversation that ranged across farming, widowhood, child-rearing, and the peculiarities of Kansas weather. And by the end of the 3 days, they had established the kind of friendship that takes some people decades. She watched Abraham with Clara and Thomas James, and she watched Abraham with Susanna, and on the second week she said to Susanna privately, "Your father would have liked him." Susanna smiled. "I know," she said. "He's the kind of man who does things," Ruth said, "not the kind who talks about doing things." "No," Susanna agreed. "He's very much a doing kind of man." Ruth looked at her daughter for a moment with the specific look of a mother who is fully satisfied about something. "You're happy," she said. "I am," Susanna said. "Good," Ruth said, and that was all, but it was everything. There was a difficult autumn in 1877 when Bjorn's horse threw him and he broke his leg badly. And Abraham and Carl managed the fall work between them with Pete and Cal and 2 extra hands from Harding. And it was the hardest 6 weeks of farming work Susanna had seen since the first harvest. But they brought it through clean, and Bjorn healed and was back on his feet before the deep cold set in. And Abraham marked the end of it by sitting down at the kitchen table on the last day of October and saying nothing for about 10 minutes, which was his way of being very tired. Susanna sat across from him with coffee and waited, and after the 10 minutes he looked up at her and said, "I am very tired." "I know," she said. "The farm's all right," he said. "I know that too," she said. "I just needed to say it." "You can say it whenever you need to," she said. He drank his coffee, and after another minute he said, "Thank you for managing everything indoors this fall. The accounts and the house and the children. You held everything while I was in the fields." "We held everything," she said. "That's what we do." He looked at her across the kitchen table in the October evening, and the lamp was between them the way it had been in their first real conversation. And the warmth between them after 4 years was not the new fire warmth of beginnings, but something deeper and more steady, the kind of warmth that has fed itself from everything they had been through together and burns long and even. "Susanna," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want you to know something," he said. "Every day I want to know it." She waited. "The day you came through that gate," he said, "with Clara on your back and your bag in your hand and your chin set like you dared anyone to have a problem with any of it." He paused. "I knew in about the first 30 seconds that you were something I hadn't met before. I didn't know what to do with that yet, but I knew it." She looked at him, and the love she felt for him was the most uncomplicated thing in her life, which was remarkable given how complicated everything else could be. "And the cradle," she said. He shook his head slightly with the faint color that came into his face whenever this came up, because Abraham Langston did not take well to being praised for things he had simply done. "I just saw what was needed," he said. "I know," she said. "That's the thing I love most about you. You just see what's needed." He was quiet. "You built a cradle," she said. "And before that, this house. And you gave Thomas his name and the boy's name, and you answered every one of Clara's questions as if they were the most important questions in the world, and you carried me through the first winter and the hard autumn and every hard thing in between." She paused. "You just see what's needed and you do it. Without drama, without wanting to be noticed for it. You just do it." He looked at her across the lamp, and the expression on his face was the one she had first seen in the unguarded moment on the harvest wagon, the one that was completely open, completely his, completely real. "You do the same," he said. "You do it for all of us every single day." She reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned it over and held hers, and the warmth of it was the warmth of a life built together, board by board and field by field and day by day. And it was the most solid thing she had ever known. In December of 1877, Susanna found herself with child again, which she told Abraham on Christmas morning. wrapped in quilts on the settle in the parlor while the children were still asleep upstairs, and the snow was coming down outside in the big, quiet flakes that turned the Kansas world into something out of a storybook. He put his arms around her and held her for a long time without saying anything, and she could feel him breathing and could feel the steady warmth of him. And outside the snow fell, and inside the fire burned, and the house that had been built for a life still being made held them the way good houses do, with solid walls and true floors and enough room for everyone who needed to be in it. "Boy or girl this time, do you think?" he asked eventually against her hair. "I have no idea," she said. "Clara will probably have an opinion." He laughed because Clara always had an opinion, and it was generally correct. The child born in August 1878 was a girl, delivered on a warm summer morning with the same unhurried efficiency with which the Langston farm did most things, and they named her Ruth, for Susanna's mother, who was visiting again and who received the news of the name by sitting very still for a moment, and then standing up and going out to the back porch, which was where she went when she felt things she didn't intend to show. Abraham found her there. He stood beside her on the porch and said nothing for a while, and then Ruth said, "That's a very good name." "We think so," he said. She looked at him. She was not a woman who made declarations easily, having been built by the same farm country as her daughter, but she looked at Abraham Langston and said, "You take good care of them." "I try," he said. "You do," she said definitely. "You do take good care of them." He nodded and she nodded, and that was the whole conversation, and it was enough. Clara adored her new sister with a fierceness that was almost alarming in a 4-year-old, appointing herself baby Ruth's primary protector and tour guide to the world, a role she would not relinquish for the next several years. Thomas James, who was 3 and deeply interested in any project that involved his sister Clara, followed this program with only slightly less intensity. The years continued to build. Bjorn married a widow from Harding in 1879, a cheerful Danish woman named Marta with 2 grown sons, and the wedding was held at the Langston farm in September after the harvest was done. And it was the occasion for such a celebration that Mrs. Garfield was heard to say it was the best party the farm had ever seen, which coming from Mrs. Garfield was a testament of the highest order. Pete found his own piece of land in 1880, a small claim east of Harding, and left the Langston employ with wages saved and references given and a farewell dinner that Susanna cooked herself because Pete had been one of the constants of the farm since before she arrived, and he deserved a proper send-off. He cried at the table, which surprised everyone including Pete, and Abraham shook his hand at the gate and said, "You're a good man, Pete. That land is lucky to get you," which was the finest thing Abraham knew how to say. Cal stayed. Cal would always stay. Cal was one of those people who belonged to a place rather than to a plan, and the Langston farm was his place, and he worked it with the same dedication year after year, becoming as much a fixture of the farm as the red barn and the cottonwood at the field corner. By 1881, the Langston farm was one of the most productive wheat operations in the county, not the largest but consistently the best managed, and Abraham was known in Harding and for 30 miles around as a man whose word was as solid as his limestone house and whose wheat was always worth buying. Susanna managed the accounts and the household with a precision that freed Abraham to give his full attention to the fields and the livestock, and the division of the work between them had the quality of a long-running conversation, each part of it making sense because the other was happening too. That year Reverend Holt asked Abraham to sit on the county agricultural board, which Abraham initially declined because he did not like committees on principle, and Susanna told him that he was exactly the kind of person who ought to be on committees because he would actually say true things rather than agreeable ones, and he went to the first meeting intending to sit quietly and came home 4 hours later having been elected vice chairman, which did not surprise Susanna in the least. She told him so. "I was going to sit quietly," he said, with the expression of a man who has been overtaken by events. "Abraham," she said, "you have never sat quietly in your life. You are one of the most actively present people I have ever known." "I thought you said I was quiet," he said. "Quietly present," she said, "not inactively. There's a difference." He considered this. "That's a distinction I appreciate," he said, and there was amusement in it. On an October evening in 1882, 9 years after the day Susanna Conley walked through the iron gate of the Langston farm with a baby on her back and a carpetbag in her hand, and not a word of apology for the situation, she sat on the porch of the house in the long golden light of a Kansas autumn evening and watched her family in the yard below. Clara, who was 9 and tall for her age and increasingly her own person in ways that were fascinating and occasionally humbling to watch, was teaching Thomas James, who was 7 and worshipful of his sister, how to tie the particular knot she'd learned from Cal for securing fence wire. Thomas James's dark eyes, his father's eyes, were fixed on her hands with total concentration. Ruth, who was 4 and perpetually convinced she was fully grown, was following Bjorn's dog around the yard with a proprietary air. Abraham was at the fence line talking to Carl about the fall rotation, and even at this distance she could see the quality of his attention, the way he looked at the field rather than at Carl while Carl was talking, because he was always thinking about the land. Thomas's compass was on her wrist now. She had had it made into a bracelet in Harding the previous year, a simple leather band with the compass set in it, and she wore it always, and when she touched it, which she did sometimes without thinking, she touched both things at once, the man who had loved her first and the man who loved her now, and they were not in competition. They were both parts of the true story of her life. Abraham came across the yard and up the porch steps and sat beside her, and she moved into his shoulder the way she did always, easily and completely, and he put his arm around her, and they looked out at the children in the last of the October light. "Good evening," he said. "Very good," she said. He looked out at the fields beyond the yard, the harvested wheat fields resting in their fall quiet, the sky going from blue to gold to the first hint of evening rose. "Winter's going to come early this year," he said. "Feel it in the air already." "Then we'll be ready early," she said. He was quiet for a moment, the comfortable quietness of a man with his wife beside him and his children in the yard and his land resting well after a good year's work. Then he said, "You know what I was thinking about today?" "Tell me," she said. "The morning you arrived," he said. "When I came out of the barn and saw you coming through the gate, you had Clara on your back and you were looking at the fields, not at the house, not at me, at the fields, like you were assessing them." She smiled because she remembered. "I was," she said. "I was trying to estimate how many acres you had." He laughed. "I know, I could tell. I thought, this woman is going to assess my farm before she tells me her name." "I told you my name immediately," she said. "After you told me what you could do," he pointed out. "Priorities," she said, and he laughed again, the full genuine laugh that had devastated her that Sunday on the ridge and continued to devastate her with satisfying regularity. She leaned further into his shoulder and listened to the sound of the children below, Clara explaining the knot with the pedagogical confidence of someone who has just learned a thing and is now an expert, Thomas James's patient questions, Ruth informing the dog of something important. The October air was cool and clean and smelled of the cut fields and the season turning. "Abraham," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm glad I came through that gate," she said. His arm tightened around her. "Yes," he said simply. "So am I." Below them, Clara finished demonstrating the knot, and Thomas James tried it himself. And it held. And Clara said something that made him stand up straight with pride. And Ruth abandoned the dog and came to see what was happening and immediately began informing both siblings about knots in general. And the evening light fell across all of them with the specific gold of a Kansas October, generous and warm and brief, in the way of all good things that are nonetheless not ending, just changing to the next good thing. The stars came out one by one above the prairie, and the farm settled into the evening quiet of a place that has been well tended, and inside the house Mrs. Garfield was making supper, and the smell of it came through the open kitchen window, and Susanna Conley Langston sat on the porch with her husband's arm around her and her children's voices in the yard below, and she was whole, and she was home, and there was not a single thread of this life left unresolved or uncertain, or in need of anything that was not already here. The cedar cradle was in Ruth's room now, and before Ruth it had held Thomas James, and before Thomas James it had held Clara, the first baby it had ever known, the baby it had been built for on an August afternoon by a man who saw what was needed and simply did it, before the first day was done. It was, Susanna thought, exactly how love ought to work, not with declarations first or conditions discussed or assurances given, just with seeing what was needed and meeting it with your hands and your attention and the whole of your capable heart. The night settled fully over the Kansas prairie, and the Langston farm was lit from within, and the family came in out of the dark one by one, the children loud and hungry, Abraham last, closing the gate behind him the way he always did, making sure the latch was set properly, looking back once over the fields as he always did before he came inside, the way a man looks at a thing he has spent his life building and finds it exactly what it was meant to be. He came up the porch steps and held the door open, and Susanna went in ahead of him, and he followed her into the light,